Nice to see you again. I hope you enjoyed that little clip about the Vikings coming over to Britain. They were coming from Denmark and some from Norway, and they came over and they landed in an island called Lindisfarne, just off the coast, east coast of England. And there they ransacked the monastery that was there, and then from there they pushed westwards, and eventually ended up taking over the whole of northeast of Britain. During that time, actually, Britain was made up of little Anglo-Saxon kingdoms at that time. So all these different kingdoms of the Vikings found it quite easy to burn and ransack and kill and do all those types of things. And eventually they totally took over that part of Britain. The clip that you saw earlier was a clip where they first came to Britain. They landed at Lindisfarne, the little island off the coast of England. There was a monastery which had been founded by one of the Celtic monks. His name was Aidan, and he had been sent over from Iona to start and make a settlement there in Lindisfarne. So it's was a beautiful monastery. But of course, that was the first stop that the Vikings took, and they totally ransacked everything. Lindisfarne's a really super little place to go. It's a very peaceful place, very spiritually. It's a very thin place spiritually, as they say. So anyway, they settled in these areas, but they continued to push further down south. But they came up against a force to be reckoned with in the south, in the kingdom of Wessex, which we all know about, King Alfred the Great. And he was the one that actually conquered the Vikings, and he then negotiated with the Vikings and said that they could have some land, but only on one condition, and that was that they be baptized. So the king of the Vikings decided, yes, this was a good idea, so he was Christianized and he was baptized, and all his people were baptized too. And all this happened around about the time of 871. It was then that Alfred the Great crushed the Danish army and forced the Danes to accept a peaceful division of the lands. The terms of peace was that Guthrum, the Danish king, and his court should be baptized.
78 at Ethelden, King Alfred defeated Guthrum of the Danes and drove them from Wessex.
I am indebted. Uhtred of Edinburgh. Wessex is indebted. There can be no negotiation, Lord. Only surrender. That is your advice. It is. I hear you. Lord.
Peace was was further secured by Earl Guthrum's baptism and acceptance of the Christian God.
Do you renounce the devil and all his work?
I do.
Let this water cleanse you and make you worthy of God's blessing. Guthrum, you are now a child of God.
Amen.
Amen.
He was a wonderful and a great king, King Alfred was. Never in Britain has a king ever been called the Great, but Alfred was called the Great. He was nicknamed the Charlemagne of Britain. He had a lot of the same attributes as Charlemagne. He loved books. He loved education. He was a man of peace. He was a wise leader, and he was also a very staunch Christian. Unlike Charlemagne, who had a questionable morality, Alfred was a chaste king. He took his Christianity very seriously. So as I said before, Alfred the Great, one of the agreements was with the Viking king that they needed to be baptized, that the people needed to be baptized and Christianized. So the Vikings were they were great men of conquest. They traveled a lot they traveled by sea. They were great seamen. And so they traveled south, further from Britain. Once they had done conquest in Britain, they then traveled down and they did conquest in France and settled in France after much ravaging and that. And then they did conquest even as far abroad as Russia, Poland, Germany, and all these places, and they settled there. But they were very fierce, and for 300 years the cry of Europe went up, and the cry was, "Oh God, save us from the Northmen." They were called the Northmen, they were called the Norsemen, and eventually they were also labeled as the Normans. And even to this day we have part of France, the northern part of France, called Normandy. And eventually in 1066 one of their leaders from Normandy, William, he eventually came and he conquered Britain and became the King of Britain. It was William who actually then conquered Britain at the Battle of Hastings and became the ruler of Britain in the year 1066. So Vikings have quite a long history. You'll find Scandinavian blood all over parts of Europe, right as far, like I say, even into Russia, and so we find that also the Viking pagan religion also has quite an influence even to this day upon Europe. So, for example, even our days of the week, when we look at the days of the week, we have Sunday, which is a Roman day, the worship of the sun, Mithras, and then we have Monday, the worship of the moon, the day of the moon, which is also Roman, and we have Saturn's, the worship of Saturn, which was Saturday. So we got Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and then we get into Tuesday, and Tuesday was Tios, which is the old English god of war and sky. Okay, so that comes actually from the Viking traditions. And then Wednesday, of course, which was Woden, British Woden, but Scandinavian Odin, was the chief god of the Viking pantheon. And Odin, even to this day, is worshipped. He's actually been, this chief god has been put back on his pedestal in Iceland, and then also in parts of Finland and Sweden and that. So we see that these gods are being reborn again into these Scandinavian countries and also into parts of Europe as well. I mean, when we look at Nazi Germany, we see that Himmler was fascinated by the Scandinavian gods. He was fascinated by the gods of the Northmen, the Vikings. And we see a lot of symbolism that comes from the magic runes of the Viking traditions. So we see all the symbolism actually in Nazi Germany, because they saw the Scandinavian blood as being Aryan blood. So there was a lot of occultic paganism that was wrapped up in Nazism. So we see that they actually started reviving all this pagan symbolism and stuff, as we see in this bracelet that Himmler had. These symbols are Viking symbols. They are the runes of the Northmen. And then we also have Thursday, which is Thor's Day, which was the day of Thor, the god of thunder, and Freya, Friday. Freya was the god of love, beauty, and fertility. So we are still using these, we are still labeling our days according to the old Viking traditions and their religion. So they have had a great influence on the whole world, actually, the Vikings, the Northmen, as they continued to push south. And they were great travelers, as I said before, but they were also very, very fierce men of war. So what was the implications of this new conquest of Britain and Europe? Well, the implications were that at that time, remember I said before that the Carolingian dynasty became quite weak once Charlemagne passed away, and he gave his domains to his 3 sons, and they were quite weak rulers. They weren't like their father, who was a talented, very gifted leader. And so because of this, what happened was that kingdoms started to arise, little kingdoms all over Europe. The whole of Europe became decentralized. It no longer had a central kingdom as it did under Charlemagne. And so it had all these little tiny confederacies that were being created all over Europe. And this was the reason why it was so easy for the Vikings to come in and to just ravage the whole of Europe, Western Europe, and to eventually settle in again as usual, as these tribes seem to do. But what emerged from this whole thing is now a system of owning land started to appear, and this system was called feudalism. And feudalism was quite a peculiar type of system, because what it entailed was a way of holding land. And so what would happen was they would get a king, and he would be over his little kingdom. And what he would do was he would actually then give land to his warriors. Okay, so he would pick men amongst his kingdom that were warrior orientated, and he would give them land. And in return for the land that the king gave his warriors, he would want his warriors to defend him against the barbarian invasions, against the Vikings, if needs be. Okay, so then the warriors now became quite well off, and they because they had land. So what they would do is they would then rent out and give their land, bits and portions of their land, to those under them. And so they would give land to the nobles that were under them, okay? And then in return for giving them land, they would say, now we want you nobles to support us when we are actually defending our land. And so it went all the way down the ladder until eventually you had at the bottom of the pile people that were called serfs or peasants. And these peasants were the ones that had no land, but their job was to work on the land of their superiors, of those that were above them that actually owned the land. So it was kind of a hierarchical type of system, whereby you became a vassal to the ones above you who owned the land. So the land that was held by these different groups, by these, there's this slowly but surely declining powers, actually was called fiefs. And if you were under a noble, you were called a vassal. But if you were over the peasants, then you were called a lord. So in the middle of the system, you got those that were vassals, but they were also lords. Now, at the bottom of this whole system, as I said before, you got the peasants and the serfs. And the sad thing about this whole feudal system was that there was no way that these peasants could ever better themselves. They were forever at the bottom of the pile, and there was no way that they would ever be able to. That's why you get these little songs like "My face is my fortune." For example, possibly if a young serf girl was very beautiful, perhaps maybe a lord that's above her would possibly take her as a bride. But this didn't very often happen very much because of the class structure was so rigid. So this didn't really happen very often. And so this was quite a tragic situation for those who were at the bottom of the pile. Now, when we look at the church and that, we see that the monasteries and the abbeys and all those, they became very rich. They actually became lords in their own right, because what was happening was that a lot of the nobles and that, they would actually donate their lands and everything to the abbeys and that. And one of the reasons being because it actually helped with taxes and everything, because it was the abbeys and the religious institutions that weren't taxed. So what the lords would do is they would donate their land to the monasteries and that, and then continue to live on the land tax-free type of thing. So there was this situation that was going on. So what happened was that the church became very rich, because at the end of the day, the abbeys and the monasteries and all that belonged to the Pope. So we see a situation where the church was getting very rich and was actually starting to own land in a very big way. So how did this affect the church? Well, it affected the church in the way that, as I spoke to you last time, a little bit about lay investiture. So what was happening was that the nobles and that of these different little principalities and kingdoms, they were putting in place into these abbeys and monasteries and churches and that, their guys, okay? They were putting their own people, those that they knew would support them in war, those that they knew would, aid them when they needed aid, and they were the ones that were being put into leadership. Now, in Italy, it was also quite a similar situation. It was feudalism was in full command there. And so there was all these principalities and kingdoms and that, and they were all divided against each other and everything. So they would fight against each other, and then the one that came out the strongest of the principalities would then be the ones that would actually choose the Pope. So I'd just like to read you something here from Church and History. It's on page 84, and it says here that between the death of Stephen VI in 891 and the accession of John XII in 955, there were no less than 20 popes. This was indeed a time of shame, disgrace, and confusion for the church. So this was what was happening in Italy at the time, because of the feudal system and because of the fact that eventually it was a huge power struggle between the little principalities and the kingdoms there. And like I said, the nobles that actually won the power struggle would be the ones that would put their pope in power. But between that time, 891 to 955, we're looking at like 66 years or so, or 64 years, there had been 20 popes. So this was a time of great disorder within the leadership of the church. And so things were not looking good for the church of that time. And then we read on page 85 of the same book that the papal office is sold, okay? And it says here that now the church was once more to be plunged into the depths of disgrace. The Italian party, the nobles of the Tuscan family, which happened to be in control at the time, made Benedict IX Pope in 1033. Now, this Benedict was only 12 years old at the time, and he turned out to be one of the worst characters ever to occupy the papal seat. His conduct was so bad that the nobles of the Crescenzio family, who were rivals of the Tuscan party, were able, in the year 1045, to drive him out of Rome. In his place, they made Sylvester III Pope. Soon, however, Benedict came back and resumed the pontificate. But after a time, he grew tired of it and brazenly sold the office of Pope for 1,000 pounds of silver to a man who now became Gregory VI. Now, this sinful practice of giving or obtaining an appointment to the church office for money is called, what is it called? Simony. News of this shameful transaction leaked out, and there was a loud outcry. As a result, Benedict refused to surrender the papal office, which he had sold. There were now 3 popes: Sylvester III, Benedict IX, and Gregory VI. This was the church of which all Christians are descendants. Both Protestants and Catholics should grieve over these days. And what year was this? Well, it was the 11th century we're now in, 1033. And so the days were growing darker for the church in many ways.